Welcome everyone to the AMS Mountain Meteorology webinar series. I'm Ethan Gutman at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and today we have a presentation by Allison Nugent and Tom Giambelluca at the University of Hawaii on orographic clouds and rain in Hawaii. So it's a fascinating and very different orographic mountain meteorology context than many of us are used to thinking about. I'm really excited to see this. I want to point out that the next webinar will be coming up in mid-August at some point. We haven't quite finalized this, so there's a chance this will change, but Matt Juglam had volunteered to give a talk on some of the changes in forecasting operations in the National Weather Service Western Regional Office. You should all be muted, so you hopefully can't talk, but at the end of this, if you have a question, we'll have time to have you click to raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or I believe you can unmute yourself to ask a question at the end. If you don't have the audio connection working properly or you'd rather just type it in, you can also type a question into the feedback box at the bottom and I'll ask it for you. I also want to point out that this was actually advertised a few different ways by the American Meteorological Society. So if you found out about this webinar through some method other than an email from me, please feel free to email me. I should put my email on here somewhere. Please feel free to email me so that I can add you to the main Mountain Meteorology webinar email list. My email address is Gutman, G-U-T-M-A-N-N, @ucar.edu. We always love to have more people join in the mountain meteorology community here. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Alison and Tom to tell us about orographic clouds and rain in Hawaii.
All right, can you hear us?
I can, and I can see your slides.
Okay, is it full screen now?
It is, and I still see your mouse pointer too.
Oh, sorry. I'm trying to move this box off to the side. There we go. Okay. All right, great. I think we're all set. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present today. Again, we'll be talking about orographic and environmental controls on precipitation patterns in Hawaii. So my name is Allison Nugent. I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And my co-presenter.
Aloha, this is Tom Giambelluca. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Environment here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa.
And Tom's going to start us off.
Okay, just to get started and to orient you to this fantastic place to study rainfall, a couple of things that you may or may not know about Hawaii's rainfall. First of all, we have the highest rainfall in the United States, reaching about 10 meters a year at one or two sites. And so that places us up in the upper range of places with rain gauges around the world, and certainly the highest rainfall in the United States. Also, we do get snow. We have mountains reaching 4,000 meters, and so we get regular snow events on those highest mountains. To be honest, we really don't know how much snow we get because we've never had a snow gauge deployed on these mountains. We are working on doing that and hope to get something on Mauna Kea, for example, which is the highest point in the Pacific. We hope to do that fairly soon. And we also have another significant form of precipitation, which is interception of cloud water by vegetation. And so we have some ecosystems that are sustained by this water that don't receive much rainfall and receive a significant amount of water by directly intercepting cloud droplets. We also have in the otherwise very wet windward areas, which are within the cloud, we get as much as 1 meter of additional precipitation per year from fog interception.
Now that you're introduced to some of the unique facts about Hawaiian rainfall, let's tell you where we're at. Right in the center of this topography map is Hawaii. It's right in the center of the Pacific. The closest continent we can fly to is North America, about 2,400 miles or a 4 to 5 hour flight to California. We are 10 hours behind UTC time, so it's currently just after 10 a.m. here in the islands. Here's a map, a close-up map of the topography of the islands. You can see on the bottom right, that's Hawaii Island, also known as the Big Island. And that's where we find our tallest mountains. So just under 14,000 feet, just over 4 kilometers. You have Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa. Then you also have Maui, Molokai, Oahu, and Kauai. And Oahu is where we live. We live just outside of Honolulu in an area called Manoa, which is a kind of a subdivision of Honolulu. But all of the islands are quite mountainous. And you'll see throughout this presentation that it plays a strong role in the precipitation that the islands receive. So here's our outline for our presentation today. First, we'll give you an intro to the environmental and orographic controls on Hawaii's weather and the resulting precipitation patterns. Then the second part of the talk is split into two. Tom is going to do part 2, talking about Hawaii rainfall research, and I will talk about part 3, which is precipitation processes. So to start us off on the environmental controls on Hawaii's precipitation, we'll have Tom take it off from here.
Okay, just to, again, orient you to the atmospheric situation here that control Hawaii's precip. We are in a region that is dominated by that Hadley cell circulation most of the time, and that is driven, of course, by strong convection at the IPCZ, which produces lots of clouds and intense rainfall at the meteorological equator. And then we have, that drives a polar transport in the upper troposphere and descending air in the outer tropics and subtropics, including the area where Hawaii is situated. And then the return flow at the surface produces easterly winds, otherwise known as the trade winds. So this Hadley cell circulation is responsible for 2 really important features, which are the persistent easterly winds and the descending air, which gives us pretty dry conditions. So the pattern of regional precipitation shown here reflects what I just talked about, with a very high rainfall along the zone that the IPCZ migrates in, which is mostly north of the equator. And then to the north and to the south of that are areas where descending air gives relatively dry conditions. And so Hawaii is in a place with otherwise dry conditions if it were not for the islands. So you're looking at somewhere between 1 and 2 millimeters per day mean precipitation for this region where Hawaii lies. All right, so that descending air in the Hadley cell circulation produces a semi-permanent cell of high pressure, the North Pacific high or North Pacific anticyclone, and it's another way to look at the currents of trade winds as flow around the south side of the subtropical high. And so the northeast trade winds affect our islands between 50 and 90% of the time. This is seasonal. It's about 90% of the time during the summer months and closer to 50% of the time during the winter. So as a result of that, we have these winds then interacting with the high topography on the islands and producing big changes, big differences in rainfall from place to place, ranging from over 15 millimeters a day on the windward sides down pretty close to 0, much less than 1 millimeter per day, around a half a millimeter per day in some of the leeward areas. We have these really spectacular gradients of rainfall, very big differences, continental scale differences in rainfall in over relatively small areas, short distances. So this is the mean annual rainfall pattern of Hawaii. This is a 30-year mean rainfall, mean precipitation. And again, you see that on the windward areas of each island, and in the case of Kauai here near the summit, we have very high rainfall. And obviously this is produced by orographic lifting of the persistent trade winds. So this point right here is, we'll show the individual points. This is one of my stations, this big bog, and it has a mean annual precipitation of more than 10 meters a year, and it's very close to the point that's traditionally identified as the rainiest place in Hawaii and rainiest place in the United States, which is Mount Waialeale at the summit of Kauai, which is again around 10 meters a year. But each island has these high rainfall areas on the windward slopes, and they are not necessarily at the highest point. Notice that these very high mountain peaks are quite dry, and on the leeward sides of the island are also quite dry.
So as Tom described, a lot of these precipitation patterns come from the Hadley circulation, from the trade winds interacting with our islands. But also, as you may imagine, there are a number of orographic mechanisms at play. And orography provides the necessary lifting for clouds and precipitation to form. So in this way, it's not surprising that precipitation is strongly controlled by the orography itself. On the bottom right are 6 examples of basic orographic mechanisms from the How's It All 2012 review paper. And I'll go through these 2 by 2 to talk about how they apply to the Hawaiian Islands in particular. So first up, when we think about tropical island precipitation in particular, the question is, which case do we have? Do we have stable stratiform or do we have convective cumuliform rainfall? And in the tropical regions, the air is often conditionally unstable. So what that means is that the air is stable for dry air, or for dry lifting, but the atmosphere is unstable for moist lifting. So as soon as you have air lifting up past the lift and condensation level, as soon as you have saturation, that air is typically unstable and begins to convect. So most of the time, the precipitation we get and the convection we get in the Hawaiian Islands is convective and cumuliform. That's not to say that we don't also get stable and stratiform cases, as you'll see later, but a majority of the rainfall we get is from warm rain processes from this convective case. Next up, something that's really important for our islands are these day and night differences. So on the left-hand side, you see a daytime scenario where as the sun heats the surface of the earth, it warms the land surface. That air becomes buoyant and rises and then begins to draw air in from the surrounding environment. This is known as a sea breeze. And especially on days when the trade winds are weak, the sea breeze pattern can be dominant. On the right-hand side, you have something a bit different. This is nighttime. And at nighttime, we see these strong changes where the land surface radiates its heat away to space. And as it radiates its heat away, the surface it cools the air above it, and then you get these downward density currents called katabatic flows. And what's pictured here is actually a convergence of the katabatic flow with the incoming trade winds. And this was the topic of a field campaign in the 1990s called the Hawaiian Rain Band Project. But in general, this is a land breeze, and when the background wind speed is weak, we have sea breezes and land breezes that can be dominant over the background flow. So these depend, of course, on the time of day, and they're driven by the temperature difference between the ocean, which is relatively constant, and the land surface temperature, which can vary more significantly. Okay, and then last but not least, there's a couple mechanisms that depend on pre-existing convection or precipitation. So on the left-hand side, on the top, you have an image of orographic enhancement, where you have a larger precipitating region. This is pre-existing convection that just happens upon the island. And even in cases like this, the island mountains can enhance the pre-existing convection or precipitation. So this will come up later when we talk about disturbances that can impact the islands. On the bottom image is the cedar feeder mechanism. And this is a little bit different. You still have pre-existing precipitation, but as the rain falls, it can capture extra water from the clouds that are located over the top of the mountains. So all of these 6 mechanisms that we discussed can enhance the amount of precipitation that you get on the islands. Okay, so on the title slide, you may recall this figure. And you might say, well, hey, Allison, you talked about mechanically forced lifting or air being pushed up a mountainside. But in both of these theoretical images, there are clouds and there's rain on the top of the islands. But in this image on the top, you have trade winds coming in, you have orographic lifting, you have an orographic cloud, which in this case looks a bit more stratiform than convective. And on the top, you have nothing. It's dry. It's not even green, so it's not getting much rainfall. And you might ask, well, why are there no clouds on the top of the mountains? And that's because in addition to the trade winds that the Hadley cell provides, it also gives us a pretty strong trade wind inversion. So what that means is that we have our trade winds coming into the islands, the air is lifted by the mountains, clouds result. Maybe you also have some thermal slope wind as well. And you might imagine that these clouds would continue to grow upwards to cover the peak of the mountain. But you have subsidence from the Hadley cell. So you have downgoing air that creates this trade wind inversion and caps the clouds at a certain level. Typically, this is just around 2 kilometers altitude. And the reason that this comes about is subsiding air from the Hadley cell goes through adiabatic warming through descent. And then you have convective mixing from the surface, which leads to the typical lapse rate that you would expect. But most of the time, these two, I should have said temperatures on the x-axis and elevation is on the y-axis. And so when you have these two lapse rates that are being formed by different mechanisms, sometimes this discontinuity in the center can develop. And that discontinuity leads to a temperature increase. And that is the reason why we have a trade wind inversion. We tend to have dry air above the trade wind inversion, moist air in the marine layer below. And this acts as a very stable layer that caps cloud development. So not only can clouds not rise up past the trade wind inversion because they're not buoyant, but also the air up above the trade wind inversion is very dry, and so the turbulent entrainment of dry air tends to cap convection at a certain height. So when there is lightning here in Hawaii, it's a very rare and special thing. Everybody goes out to take a look. But what this looks like then is what Tom had already mentioned, where on the bottom you have terrain for the Big Island and precipitation for the Big Island. And we have our wind direction always from the northeast, from right to left. And you see that these tallest mountain peaks, Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa, don't have much rain. And that's because Hawaii Island is so tall that it extends above the trade wind inversion. And so you can't get much rain up there. Okay, so this concludes the part one. We wanted to give you a quick overview of controls on Hawaii's weather, because I think for most of you it's quite different than the continental U.S., and it may be something that you're not aware of. But in terms of environmental controls, the big driver is the Hadley cell. The Hadley cell drives our trade winds and our trade wind inversion. Now, something that I didn't mention is we also occasionally have disturbances. So while 50 to 90% of the time we have trade winds, sometimes we have cold fronts or Kona storms, which are upper-level lows, and tropical storms. And when we have these disturbances, they disrupt the Hadley subsidence, they remove the trade wind inversion, and that's the time that we can occasionally get deep convection and widespread rainfall. It's not very common, but it's exciting when it happens. Now, all of those environmental controls, right on the slide, they're given as two separate things, environmental controls and orographic controls. But actually they work together. So orographic controls, we know that mountains enhance clouds and precipitation, and you have orographic uplift and diurnal patterns. But you can have orographic enhancement of precipitation from these disturbances. You can have diurnal patterns when the trade winds are weak. So all of these things are acting together to produce our resulting precipitation, which in general is high rainfall totals on the windward slopes. Lee sides, the downwind side of the mountains, are usually quite dry, and oftentimes the tall mountaintops are dry as well. And again, that's because the cloud growth is stunted by the trade wind inversion. So just coming back to this climatological figure of Hawaiian rainfall, we can see our windward slopes are wet, our tall peaks are relatively dry, and the leeward sides of the islands are also relatively dry. So with that, I'm going to pass off to Tom.
So we're looking at the mean annual rainfall map of the Hawaiian Islands again, and this is one of the things that my laboratory works on is trying to map rainfall and other climate variables, just to look at those spatial patterns. So just more generally, though, we when it comes to rainfall-related research, we do a number of things. One of them is to actually measure rainfall. So we have monitoring networks around the islands that measure rainfall as well as other climate variables. And again, we do map variables using our own data and all the other data that we can find. So we do look at mean patterns, climatology. We also produce month-year maps, so individual months, and daily maps as well. And currently we're working on a system to produce near real-time mapping at first monthly and then sub-monthly, daily, and perhaps in the future sub-daily intervals. With those data, we have done analysis of historical trends to see how things are changing in Hawaii, looking at temperature and precipitation and other variables. And we are looking at the future, trying to project how global climate change will affect climate in Hawaii, particularly rainfall. So just looking at each of those, climate monitoring, one of our networks is on Maui, on Haleakala, which is a 10,000 foot, 3,000 meter volcano on the east side of the island, and I installed the first stations in that network nearly 31 years ago in June 1988, and they're still going. And you can see the distribution of those stations on the map and on the kind of profile diagram. So they span the windward and leeward sides and mainly focused on the high elevation, so from about 950 meters up to the summit. We, as I said, map variables, and one of our main kind of resources that we maintain is the Rainfall Atlas of Hawaii, and this is a website that has all manner of information about rainfall in Hawaii. I recommend that you take a look at it. You can just Google Rainfall Atlas of Hawaii. The URL, I think, is going to be shown on the next slide, but it's pretty easy to find by Googling it. There's an interactive map, and there's data downloads available, images, rasters, and tabulated data. So here's the URL, rainfall.geography.hawaii.edu. Please take a look. And we also map other things. Besides rainfall, we have maps that we've done, spatial analyses we've done of other variables that are also available online, including air temperature, relative humidity, modeled clear sky radiation, cloud frequency based on satellite imagery, solar radiation, net radiation, potential evapotranspiration, and actual evapotranspiration. So there are links to these other websites on the Rainfall Atlas of Hawaii webpage. So currently, we are looking at producing near real-time maps, and this is the rain gauge network that we have to do rainfall mapping. And we have we're now in the process of refining a product that automatically grabs the data from all sources that are available online. Eventually, we'll do QA/QC and gap filling, and then use kriging to interpolate those data. So this particular map is for April 2019, and it was produced on May 1st. So the idea is that these products will be done the day after the end of the period. So in this case, we're starting with monthly, and within a few months, I would say within 6 months for sure, we hope to have this available with all the processing steps in place at a daily interval as well as monthly. Eventually, we'll also extend this to other variables, and with rainfall and other variables, we'll be able to produce a number of derived products, such as drought indices, fire hazard, irrigation, and other applications, groundwater recharge, and so forth. So, looking at how rainfall is changing in Hawaii and other variables are changing is one of the things that my laboratory does. This is a map of the temporal trends in rainfall over the period since 1920, and the red colors in the maps on the right side are showing areas where rainfall has been declining. The hatched areas are those areas with significant trends. And we see that in both the wet and dry seasons over that nearly 100-year period, we have been generally having declines in rainfall pretty much everywhere, but especially on the west side of the Big Island and especially in the dry season. So you can see this area, which is known as Kona, this Kona district, and other adjoining areas on the west side of the Big Island have seen big declines in rainfall over the period since the early 20th century. This could be part of a long-term trend. This is an analysis that was published by Henry Diaz and others, including me. And this is basically looking at winter rainfall, doing a 500-year reconstruction of Hawaiian winter rainfall. You see that one of the main features of this time series is a pretty robust decline beginning around the middle of the 19th century and continuing up to the present. Now, looking ahead, one of the issues here in Hawaii is that we are often not included in the so-called national climate products. So many national climate products look like that map there in front of you. So you may not notice that, but we notice it because it is excluding Hawaii as well as Alaska. But that gives us an opportunity to put our expertise to work and focus on these issues and produce products specifically for Hawaii. And that includes downscaling of climate projections. And there have been some downscaling analyses completed for Hawaii. So the top two panels here are statistical downscaling results for the wet season on the left and the dry season on the right, showing the change in rainfall by the end of end of this century, and this was led by Oliver, Allison, Tim, and it generally shows continuing declines in rainfall, especially in the already dry areas of the leeward sides of the islands and the higher elevations. The lower panels are derived from a WRF regional model, so this is dynamical downscaling using the pseudo-global warming approach. And this effort was led by Chun-Shi Zhang when he was here at the University of Hawaii. And you see that the pattern is quite different. So in general, it shows a much wetter future than the statistical downscaling does currently. So we still have quite a bit of uncertainty about how rainfall will change throughout the rest of this century, and it's something we're continuing to work on. One of those efforts is now reaching close to a conclusion as a collaboration between Ethan's group at NCAR and the University of Hawaii. So we expect to have some new dynamical downscaling results coming out pretty soon.
Okay, so I'm going to take away part 3. But before I do so, I just want to go back to this slide that Tom had up, because I did most of I did my PhD and my postdoc in the continental U.S., and I didn't think anything of this, but I've been in Hawaii now 2.5 years, and it was a big problem when I first got here, because as you'll see, my areas of interest are on the mesoscale and microscale, but they depend on knowing this background precipitation pattern. And so if it weren't for Tom's group and all the work that he's done in the geography department to map rainfall and to have these great records of rainfall over the last almost 100 years, it would make my job a lot more difficult. So I just wanted to give you a hat tip before I move on. So part 3, I want to talk about my research in the Nugent lab on precipitation processes. So Tom is really focused on mapping and projections, whereas I'm more interested in the mesoscale and the microscale processes that are involved in the formation of rainfall and the convection that precedes it. So I have a couple of points on the left. Some of my work focuses on process modeling of orographic precipitation. I've done some work using the Smith linear model to look at which aspects of precipitation are mechanically forced and therefore which ones are missing from diurnal fluctuations. I also have an area of research on aerosol impacts on orographic precipitation. So the aerosols that I'm interested in are sea salt aerosols and volcanic emissions. And then at the bottom, I've also done some work on orographic impacts on mesoscale disturbances. I have some current work looking at precipitation from Hurricane Lane, which you may have heard of from August 2018 of last year. And today I'm just going to choose this second point. I want to tell you a little bit about aerosol impacts on orographic precipitation, in part because I think it's so different than what Tom was talking about, and it shows you how multifaceted this issue of understanding precipitation on tropical islands or any place really is. So for those of you that don't know, aerosols are small, less than 10 micron matter or particles suspended in the air. So this could be salt, pollen, dust, organic material, etc. Now this picture is a picture I took from a helicopter on Kauai's Nepali coast. I chose it to show to you today, one, because it's really beautiful, and two, because as you look into the distance, you can see that the mountains get lighter and lighter. And that's because of all of the salt that's in the atmosphere in this region. And depending on the properties of aerosols in general, they've been shown to either enhance or inhibit the production of rainfall by modifying cloud properties. So I mentioned this already, but I'll talk to you a bit about sea salt aerosol. Sea salt is hygroscopic, meaning it likes water, and it's attracted to water. Sea salt aerosols are also quite large, and they've been shown to broaden the cloud drop size distribution and accelerate rain production. And the second type of aerosol that I'll talk to you about today is volcanic aerosol. Volcanic aerosol is small, numerous, typically composed of sulfate particles, and they've been shown to decrease cloud drop sizes and increase cloud drop numbers, which acts to decelerate rain production. So I find this really interesting because both of these are aerosols, both salt and volcanic aerosols are aerosols, but they act in very different ways when it comes to precipitation. So first, let's talk about sea salt aerosols. The motivation for this is that giant sea salt aerosols are a known mechanism for rapid formation of warm rain. Sea salt aerosols are also known as giant cloud condensation nuclei, or GCCN, and they have sizes from 1 to 10 microns. And in prior research, cloud droplets formed on GCCN have been shown to grow faster than other cloud condensation nuclei. So if you imagine this air coming in from over the ocean, of course it has sea salt aerosols in the atmosphere, and then that air is lifted by the orography of the mountains. And one of the big open questions in orographic precipitation in coastal regions is how do you get rainfall forming so close to the coastline? And this is one of the theories for how that could occur. So one prong of my research is observing giant cloud condensation nuclei in Hawaii. And I've been doing that with kites. So on the right-hand side, you see a kite, and you can't see the string, but you can see 3 sensors attached to the kite line. So what I do is I fly the kite, I attach sensors, and I measure the steady trade wind flow from the windward coast. The sensors that are attached are an instrument that I designed called a mini GNI, or the Mini Giant Nucleus Impactor. It's an Arduino instrument that has pressure, altitude, temperature, humidity, and orientation on it. And you'll see in a moment that it also has slides for sea salt to impact onto. So on the right is a movie. I'll play it at least twice for you. But what I do is I go to the beach, I launch a kite, I attach my instruments, I then extend the kite to the desired altitude. I open the door, which exposes a slide via remote control. And then sea salt aerosols are able to impact onto the slide, exposed to the free airstream. I'll play this movie again. You can see this door is opening, and out pops this slide. That's the slide that collects the sea salt aerosols. Then I close up the door, reel in the kite, recover the slide, and analyze it in a lab. The reason that this procedure is so important is because I want to know what the sea salt aerosol size distribution is at one specific altitude. So one question that you could ask from this research is, how do sea salt aerosol sizes vary as a function of wind speed? And this is something that there's been a lot of research in before, but never with this method and never with a kite. So here's the colored curves are from a 1953 paper by Woodcock, and it shows the sea salt aerosol size distribution at cloud base. So on the x-axis is size, the y-axis is number, and the color denotes the background wind speed. So this is for 1 meter per second. Now the red line is for 4 meters per second. You can see that as the wind speed increases, the size as well as the number of sea salt aerosols in the atmosphere also increases. And I just put a bunch more lines on there. This is for 9, 15, and 35 meters per second. So this is all prior research, actually done here in the Hawaiian Islands. There's a lot of warm rain research that has been done here in the last 50, 60 years, starting from Project Shower in 1954. This has been a very popular place for warm rain research. But what I'm going to add now are some lines that I've collected. So the black lines are my observations from this kite-based research. And what you can see is that the wind speed was about 10 meters per second on that day, and it lines up really well with these prior observations. Okay, so I'm really excited about this because when the trade winds are strong, orographic uplift is also strong. You have that wind being pushed up the mountains, it leads to stronger vertical velocities. But also, I just showed you that when wind speeds are strong, sea salt aerosols are more numerous and large. And these two aspects then can work together to enhance orographic rainfall on high wind days. I'm not giving you any evidence of this at this point. A lot of my research thus far has been in collecting these sea salt aerosol size distributions. But what I've found in the past is that if you look at the diurnal precipitation cycle on islands, it's often driven by the background precipitation, not a diurnal precipitation cycle. And this could be one piece of evidence to suggest why that may be, because these two things are acting in tandem. Okay, now I'll tell you a little bit about volcanic aerosol. So in some of Tom's prior work, you can see this image on the right. Tom showed this to you earlier. This is the Hawaiian rainfall trends from 1920 to 2012. And it shows that there's been a decrease in precipitation of about more than 5% per decade on the lee side, the downwind side of the Big Island of Hawaii. Well, at the same time, there have been continuous volcanic emissions from both the summit of Kilauea and the East Rift Zone. And those emissions are shown in this plot on the left, starting from 1978 to 2015. In Fraser and Giambelluca, they hypothesized that volcanic emissions may be reducing rainfall on the leeward side of Hawaii Island. And I thought, oh, I could look into that and see if that idea holds water. So what I've been doing with my graduate student Tianqi is idealized WRF numerical simulations. So what's shown here on the top row are WRF simulations with no emissions, no aerosol emissions, and the bottom shows WRF simulations with volcanic emissions from those two source locations, the summit and the rift. And not surprisingly, when you have volcanic aerosols, you also have more numerous cloud droplets that are smaller. This isn't too surprising. It's pretty expected. That's what you would hope that a model could reproduce. But what we can do with this is then take it a step further and look at rainfall differences from different volcanic aerosol emission scenarios. So on the left are 4 images. The top left is the same control case with no aerosol emissions. Top right is with a small source. Bottom left is a moderate volcanic aerosol emission source. The bottom right is a large source. And now it's quite subtle. This is just a 24-hour rainfall difference. But if you compare the control case to these larger aerosol sources, you can see that rainfall lessens in the cases with larger volcanic emissions, and it shifts slightly downstream. What we can't really get at from these simulations are rainfall differences in the Kona region. And that's twofold. One, because our simulations aren't long enough currently to get the aerosol into that Kona region, and also because the rainfall there is already really low. Tom mentioned that it's less than 1 millimeter per day. And so it's not too surprising that in one simulation day, we don't get rainfall there. But what we're working on currently is longer-term simulations to see whether we can see a difference or connection between volcanic aerosol emissions and rainfall. So this is my last slide, but I just wanted to bring it all together and say we've talked about all these environmental controls on precipitation, but the idea is that on top of these large-scale, long-term precipitation changes and patterns, it's likely that local aspects like aerosols can modulate precipitation processes. Okay, so one last slide is our summary slide. At the beginning, we told you about the Hadley cell driving trade wind inversion. We talked about how orographic precipitation in the Hawaiian Islands is largely controlled by these a combination of the environmental processes and orographic processes. And then in the second part, Tom told you about some current efforts underway to map the precipitation across the islands, to learn how precipitation has changed over time, and to downscale from climate models to local precipitation, which is much harder than one would hope. And then in the third and final part, I talked to you about how we can sample sea salt aerosols and what connection they may have to orographic precipitation. And then in general, just learning about how local aerosols can be impacting cloud microphysics and precipitation in the Hawaiian Islands. So with that, we'd be very, very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Allison. So as a reminder to everybody else on the call, you're muted. Hopefully you're not all getting the echo that I'm getting right now. If you would like to speak, either raise your hand, or I believe you can unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can type a question in the participant feedback box and I'll ask it for you if you can't get the audio to connect. I see Dale has already figured this system out and raised his hand, so I will get him unmuted and let him start us off. Okay, you should be able to go, Dale.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah? Thanks very much for this very interesting presentation. I had one quick question that cropped up with respect to the dynamical and statistical downscaling for changes in precipitation, which is with the pseudo-global warming approach. It seems like it's certainly not surprising that you have an increase in precipitation since a lot of the dynamics are so locally driven, and you'd have the thermodynamics pushing you in the direction of higher water vapor content and more precipitation in the same locally generated dynamics. And so I wondered if oops, I'm getting an echo.
Tom, do you want to briefly?
We can hear you fine.
Yeah, we don't have echo.
Okay, good. Then I'm going to ignore the echo I hear. And I just wondered if you have anything you'd like to share about your new dynamical downscaling or hypotheses about why the difference occurred with statistical downscaling and your earlier dynamical downscaling.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you're right that, one of the things to consider is what are the limitations of the pseudo-global warming approach, which basically builds in the current variability, kind of the current or recent historical variability into the future projection. So it constrains the projected changes to those that would be, the more thermodynamic ones, the ones that are influenced by higher sea surface temperature and a more humid atmosphere, where we, think that we could be missing changes in variability. For example, the mid-latitude storm tracks, the winter disturbances that we get in the Hawaiian Islands now could, for example, shift poleward. We're currently at the southern edge of influence of those storm tracks, and so any poleward shift in storm tracks would reduce the frequency of cold fronts, Kona storms, and upper level lows in the winter, and could, as a result, reduce the number of events, even though we would perhaps have higher intensity rainfall during events when they do occur. And so those are some of the concerns. The concern with statistical downscaling of the type that we used is whether the kind of statistical relationships between large scale patterns of pressure and moisture transport will hold under a changed climate. Are they stationary? And we try to address that by making sure we include all of the potentially relevant variables and look at all their effects on changes in the future. But these are questions we're continuing to ask, and we don't have answers to everything. One possible effort is to do direct downscaling without using pseudo-global warming. In other words, to downscale model runs for current and future and look at the differences there. Of course, that introduces other possible biases, but we're continuing to work on that. Thanks for the question.
Thanks.
So I'll take the opportunity when people are gathering their thoughts. I'm just going to mute you, Tom, briefly to kill the echo. But I'll take the opportunity to ask questions. I'm curious, Allison, if you thought of modifying your kite measurement system so that you can actually measure the aerosol impacts in situ with some sort of piezoelectric sensor or similar kind of approach that you could connect directly to the Arduino and then have it running in real time and collecting long time series of measurements.
I haven't. So one of the problems with sampling sea salt aerosols is that they exist at this size range that's in between aerosols and cloud droplets. So I don't know of some mechanism that could sample that size range. I suppose that if you were using some sort of a piezoresistive sensor, you would be getting impaction from whatever's in the atmosphere. And it's likely that because sea salt is so hygroscopic, it typically exists in a wetted or a deliquesced form. And so I think it would be hard to know how much salt is in the water droplet that's impacting the sensor. Thus far, the only way that I know to get size distribution of sea salt is to have it impact onto the slide, dry there, and then analyze it in the lab. But if you have some ideas for me, I would love to have time series of sea salt. I just don't currently know of a mechanism to do so. That especially what's small enough to be lofted by a kite type platform.
Maybe we can connect some ideas, though I'm not sure any of them actually work.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your ideas. Yeah, I didn't say that, but a lot of the work that I presented is stuff that's ongoing now. I've only been in Hawaii 2 years, and so the amount of research that I have doesn't even pale in comparison to the work that Tom started before I was born. So if anybody has ideas, I'd love to collaborate with you. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
And Tom, one other thing I've always found fascinating in your work and just mapping climate is the use of virtual stations where you're looking at ecological data and species presence or absence as one way of mapping climate. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how that's worked, because it strikes me that it may be useful in a lot of other locations, though maybe not quite as useful as it is in Hawaii.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. For our Rainfall Atlas of Hawaii basic annual and mean monthly climatology. Actually, the first Rainfall Atlas of Hawaii was a paper report that I published in 1986, I think it was. And so it's been around for a long time. This one that's shown on the screen currently is was produced all digitally and so forth. But in between those two, I got many messages from other scientists around the islands and from other places saying, your rainfall estimate here is not right for one reason or another. And one of those people was a guy named Jonathan Price, who's at the University of Hawaii Hilo. He's an ecologist. He's a specialist on the distribution of native and non-native plants in Hawaii. And he was adamant that, there were certain places that the rainfall estimate in the original Rainfall Atlas was way off. So when I came to do this brand new version of the Rainfall Atlas, I asked him to put his money where his mouth is and to give me some virtual rainfall stations. And so he did that by identifying ecotones, places where there's a boundary between the distribution of a particular species, for example, and areas where it's not found. And he was able to make estimates of rainfall in those areas. Now, that's obviously not as good as having a rain gauge operating for 30 years in that location, but it's better than nothing. And despite the fact that we have somewhere around 400 rain gauges in Hawaii right now, we have nowhere near enough rain gauges to give really accurate estimates of the patterns of rainfall everywhere. So we have some pretty big areas where there are steep gradients and complex patterns where we don't have enough observations to really nail down the pattern. So having these additional points on the landscape in areas where we don't have any other information was really crucial. I would like to add that these mean maps are really important for us, not just to look at the climatology, but also for mapping rainfall at through time, because we use climatologically aided interpolation. So rather than just interpolating raw values for a particular month, for example, we take the ratio of the observed value to the mean and we interpolate that, then multiply that back times the mean surface to get the individual monthly or daily pattern. And that works pretty well in the islands, particularly when we have sparse gauges, but we have other information that tells us what the patterns are.
Thanks. So if there are no other questions, I think it's about time to wrap up. If you have a question, raise your hand quickly before we warm up. I just want to remind everyone that the next Mountain Meteorology webinar series will be in mid-August. We're still working out the exact details. If you found out about this webinar through one of the AMS tweets or Facebook posts or the like and want to get added to the regular AMS Mountain Meteorology webinar email list, please send me an email. My name is Ethan Gutmann, and my email address is Gutmann, Gutmann, at ucar.edu. And I just noticed Jessica Lindquist typed a note in asking, could the kite be applied to other environments, or is it really uniquely suited to the Hawaii beach?
So I think it absolutely could be applied to other environments. Because we have trade winds here, it's really easy to do here, but I've been looking into other options. There's something called a helikite, which is kind of a mix between a balloon and a kite. You can put helium in it, but it also has wings. And so if you are in a location that doesn't have enough wind to get the kite off the ground, a helikite may be a good option. But I think there's really great opportunity for this kind of thing. I especially like it. I didn't say this, but drones only have a flying time of about half an hour. Maybe the best ones can do 40 minutes, but no more than an hour. And so the best thing about being able to do this with a kite is that I can put it up there. Some of my instrument batteries last 5 or 6 hours, and I can get really nice time series over time with multiple altitudes being sampled simultaneously. And so because we are in this time when instrumentation is shrinking and technology is getting smaller and smaller, it allows us to go back to some of these methods that were used years and years ago and do it way better than they could. So Jessica, yeah, if you want to talk about it, I have some great ideas for how it could be used elsewhere as well. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think people use kites on Niwot Ridge at some point as well. It may have been primarily for your photographs. Another source of kites for scientific data.
Yeah, I've tried to fly kites on a mountain ridge, and the downward flow on the lee side caused some problems. So it's better if it's a windward location, but as long as you can figure out what the local wind patterns are, then I think you can fly a kite there. Yeah.
All right. Thank you once again. Reminder, everybody, that we'll have the next mountain meteorology webinar in mid-August. Thank you for coming, and we'll have this recording posted to the AMS Mountain Meteorology Webinar webpage, hopefully in the next day or two. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ethan. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.